Our Pyro Archon is finally here, and in this video I will give you every detail about her kit, a full weapon spreadsheet to highlight her best and worst option, talent priority, best artifacts, constellations, themes, and a few examples on how to actually play her effectively. Mavuika has a lot going on. She has a very strong on-field presence with one of the strongest front-loaded hits in the game, and can also be versatile but with a very important downside we will explore later in the video. Not wasting time, let's start with how she works, and I promise you I won't just read her kit out loud. Her elemental skill once cast will give you the Night Soul Blessing state, 80 Night Soul points, and it has two forms. If you tap it, she will simply deal pyro damage in AoE around you every 2 seconds. This has no internal cooldown, which means it actually applies pyro every 2 seconds. If you hold the skill, she hops on her bike and gets a pyro infusion, which makes all her attacks have new multipliers that are still considered the normal or charge attack damage, although they're tied with the skill's levels. This is why you won't really need to level up her normal attack talent. Additionally, you can also swap stance by recasting her skill. Multiple actions and simply staying in Night Soul Blessing slowly decreases its point until 0, where the state will end. Now, fun fact, her skill provides 5 pyro particles, and that's kind of funny because I haven't explained the number one mechanic that makes Mavuika stand out, and that's her fighting spirit, which essentially replaces elemental energy. Her burst doesn't have an energy cost, but a fighting spirit cost. You get fighting spirit in 2 ways. Any normal attack done by your team will give you 1.5, and any Night Soul point consumed by anyone in the party becomes 1-1 more fighting spirit. Because of this, Mavuika is a character that highly synergizes with Natlan units. Consuming Night Soul points is by far better than spamming normal attacks. She can have up to 200, and the burst can be cast anywhere between 100 and the maximum. It consists of a pretty big initial hit, 7 seconds of Night Soul Blessing state with a pyro infusion, and increased multipliers to all of this depending on the amount of fighting spirit. And guess what? She also supposedly has increased resistance to interruption. Supposedly, because it turns out she's literally immune to being interrupted during her burst, which is pretty handy. I will come back to this talent in a moment, as it's really important. Quickly on her passives, they're actually quite simple. Ascension 1 will make any Night Soul burst give her 30% attack for 10 seconds, which is basically a permanent buff if you have 3 Natlan characters or some other ways to trigger Night Soul burst. Ascension 4 is also interesting. It will make the burst activated damage percentage buff to anyone that is on field for the next 20 seconds. The buff is based on the amount of fighting spirit she has when it is cast, and it decays with time. On screen, a quick example of what you can expect from this talent. At 200 fighting spirit, this will start at 40%. She basically uses the most important part for herself, and what's remaining goes to whoever is next in the rotation. These 2 passives gives her 2 buffs that many damage dealers want, attack and damage percentage. Her exploration passives are instead the decrease to Night Soul transmission cooldown by 20% and the usual switch-in mechanics, coupled with the fact that she can ride her bike on land, water, mountains, and even fly with it. This was her kit. Actually, compared to Hoyu's standards in riding, she's not that complicated. But let's go back to fighting spirit, some numbers, and how to actually play Mavuika. She can be played both on and off the field. When on the field, she's a classic pyro on-fielder, either going for a reactionless team or chasing Vaporize and Melt. Off field instead, she simply applies pyro every 2 seconds for 12 seconds, has a quick nuke, and technically a buff, plus she could carry Cinder City. But I have to say she's a really strong character with a really strong on-field presence that might scare away many units that could use her as a support but fail to deliver more damage than her. These are her multipliers at talent level 10, and this is how they change when increasing fighting spirit. If you're not familiar with these numbers, let me tell you that they are pretty big, and that's before considering that you can vaporize or melt many of them. Mavuika can seriously nuke with her burst in the 7 digits without constellation on her or teammates. The damage is still high, but much lower for her attacks. Her charge attack combo is actually the main way she deals damage, which is just a big spin with up to 9 total hits, of which you can vaporize or melt up to 5 of them. Talent priority wants burst and skill leveled up as much as possible, since both hold their attack multipliers. Generally, it's skill over burst, but the other way around when reacting her burst can be better. I'd honestly simply crown both if she's going to be your damage dealer. The attack talent can instead stay at level 1. Now, this is not the team section yet, but I want to teach you one way to play her effectively. Otherwise I'm just yapping, and once you have her, you might be unsure on when to do what. So, if Mavuika is your damage dealer, you generally start a rotation with her skill, set up the rest of the team, ideally farming Fighting Spirit, go back to her and cast her burst with her combo. Let's look at one of the cheapest but still pretty decent team she can play in. Mavuika, Bennett, Rosario and Kachina. Bennett, as the former Pyro Archon, is simply amazing to Mavuika, offering everything an attack scaling Pyro character wants. Rosario enables your melts and Kachina buffs via the scrolls set and provides Fighting Spirit. We can Mavuika skill into Kachina skill, which will activate scrolls and also farm Fighting Spirit. Bennett, Rosario and back to Mavuika. You might not melt exactly everything since Mavuika applies quite a bit of Pyro, but the most important hits are melted, and for a team this cheap, it will do pretty alright. We're using Mavuika skill as an opening, very similarly to how you cast Raiden skill before anything else, which will be one of the ways she actually gives herself Fighting Spirit, since she consumes Night Soul points, but depending on the length of your rotation, she might not consume all of them. On-fielding with her hold skill is also a way to farm Fighting Spirit, but outside of her burst, it is generally not advised to do so. When played off-field instead, Mavuika will still want somebody to give her Fighting Spirit if her burst is cast, but she can be used as an enabler for various teammates that need pyro application off-field and some damage. The skill cast here will fall at different timing depending on your needs. A Molani team, for example, doesn't exactly need to cast it as soon as the rotation starts. It would actually be better to not do that so that Hydra Swirls or other buffs can be activated first. Now, before looking at a full build breakdown with weapons, artifacts and stats, let me remind you to like or sub if you want to support and help me keep making more content. This section will mainly cover on-field Mavuika, but I will also stop to point out differences to her build when she's playing exclusively as an off-fielder / support. For the weapons, we decided to actually make two charts. Both include Bennett as a buffer and Shilonen for Fighting Spirit generation with scrolls set. These results will be very similar among other units as well. Carrying a Bennett plus a scrolls holder is going to be a very common scenario for Mavuika. However, we either consider reactions or we don't. That's why we split it in two, showcasing the difference between options that can use Elemental Mastery and options that can't. Let's look at the reacted chart first. Obviously, her Bastion slot is simply a great choice for both drip and damage. Most notably, we will also see Serpent Spine when it's possible to keep its stacks up and weapons like Red Horn thanks to its stats. Verdict can also be good assuming you don't overbuild crit rate. Then we pretty much go straight to free-to-play options that include Fontaine Craftable and Mailed Flower, the 3.5 free weapon that synergizes with this playstyle. Looking instead at the unreacted chart, not much changes aside from any Elemental Mastery going away. The ranking for 5-star options and Serpent Spine stays pretty much the same. I also want to point out that since these Calcs include a good amount of attack buffs, weapons like Wolf and Unforged will likely perform a bit better if you don't buff attack by much, which is however unlikely. Now, the thing with your artifacts is that she clearly has a Bastion slot option with the Obsidian Codex, but the way it works is a bit weird. She does not consume Night Soul points during the burst, but once cast, the set is activated once, giving her 6 seconds of uptime. Result is that everything is buffed except your last few hits, depending on the combo you do. Marichosi is a very close contender in Furina teams, and then we don't have much. Crimson Witch could see play if you just want to nuke her burst, and then everything else is comparable to 2-piece plus 2-piece options. Shimenawa doesn't work since she doesn't have energy, and that's about it. As an off-fielder, things can change quite a bit. Obsidian can activate the crit rate only by consuming Night Soul points when on field, and when the burst is cast, which is something even a support Mavuika technically wants to do to activate their damage percentage buff. Scrolls is also great for self-damage and of course buffing your teammates. Its only downside is a useless 2-piece bonus. If Shilonen or other Scrolls users are in the team, then Golden Troop, situationally Deep Food, Tenacity and similar set can be chosen, but again, be aware of how formidable she can be as a damage dealer before trying these builds. And for main stats, Goblet is Pyro, rarely attack percentage unless tons of damage percentage buffs are there and not many for attack. Circlet is crit, preferably crit damage because of Obsidian Codex. The discussion for the sense is a little bit more complicated. Of course, when you don't trigger reactions, Elemental Mastery is useless, but when you do, it is better than attack percentage, but only provided you actually melt or vaporize her hits, especially the burst cast, which is something that might depend on the amount of cryo or hydro you apply. Provided enough, she can trigger a reaction on these hits. Substats follow along pretty nicely for either playstyle, so crit over attack percentage and elemental mastery over flat attack, and keep in mind that energy recharge is absolutely useless. Before the team section, a very quick overview just for the first two constellations. C1 increases her Knight's Soul points maximum to 120, and she gets Fighting Spirit 25% more efficiently, which helps her burst even without Natron teammates. She also gets 40% attack, basically always, because why not? C2 increases base attack. Yes, you heard that right, plus 200 base attack, which translates to a ton more attack thanks to the self buffs and possible substats. Additionally, the top version of her skill will decrease defense by 20% to opponents nearby, and being on her motorcycle will simply increase all of her normal, charged and burst damage. And obviously really strong C2, both for support and DPS Mavuika. The only thing to note is that the defense of her off-field stance is not active during her burst or on-field stance. Signature or new teammates can have a higher value than C1, but likely not C2. And now it's time to talk about teams. Her Fighting Spirit mechanic makes you really want at least a Natlan character. However, consider the fact that in the Abyss, she will always start with a full 200 Fighting Spirit, but just like Elemental Energy, that only happens in Chamber 1. So let me give you a few more ways to obtain Fighting Spirit. Shilonen, for example, with her usual skill plus 2 normals combo, reaches 90 plus 9 soul points, and then they all get consumed instantly, becoming Fighting Spirit. For this, Shilonen is going to be a stable, strong option for many Mavuika teams, as a Zero Kachina will slowly consume 69 soul points in a skill cast, Moalani consumes 60, but can regenerate 20 twice, so technically 100. Jaska is 80, Kinich depends on how well you play him, but anywhere between 60 and 100. If you want to get 100 consistently, check out my last video on him. Zilal is time sensitive, but you can expect around 70 in a common rotation. Pyro Traveler can be more than 90, but takes a long time. And finally, Auroron highly depends, but can also slowly be up to 90. Remember that Mavuika burst will consume Fighting Spirit on cast, and getting more during the burst won't really do anything other than start farming for the next one. Slotting a Natlan character in a Mavuika team will not be mandatory, but very advised. Without any Night Soul points, a normal attack spam character might barely keep her bursting every rotation, but likely with the minimum amount of Fighting Spirit. Let's see some team examples. I will cover 3 main team archetypes: Hyper/Mono Pyro teams, Reaction teams, either Vaporize or Melt, and teams in which Mavuika works as a support. Most notable teammates are going to be Bennett and Shilonen. This duo technically works for any team archetype. You can add Furina for Vape, Cryo for Melt, or any buffer or off-fielder. Vaporites can utilize Furina really well, since Pyro on Hydro is a reverse reaction, consuming less of the Hydro aura. It will be very likely to vape every hit that can vape against a single target. We also have the usual combo of Xinshu and or Yelan that however requires Mavuika to use a different combo, spamming normal attacks instead of her spins. For Melt, we either decide to play one Cryo unit and not melt exactly everything, but still the most important hits, or we opt to bring 2 Cryo units to make it more reliable. But I'm not a big fan of doubling up on your Cryo, as Mavuika has a hit in which she applies Pyro back to back, and that could establish a Pyro aura that is quite hard for Cryo units to revert. But regardless, there are quite the number of Cryo units that she could technically slot in. Generally, Silali, Rosaria and C6Keia are the ones that can potentially apply the most Cryo. Other options will likely be able to only sustain the Melt on her burst, which still represents a very good portion of her total damage. Moving on, Shiver's teams are not perfect, but technically very playable. The issue is that Auroron wants a second Electro unit to generate more Fighting Spirit, which means giving up Bennett. And honestly, just any buffer and off-field damage can be a decent team for Mavuika. Anemo units like Kazuha and Sucrus can do a great job too, especially the latter in Melt teams. For off-field Mavuika, things are a bit complicated, because she's not a direct upgrade if we only consider the ability to keep applying Pyro. In that regard, Shunling simply applies more of their element. However, she comes with a possible damage percentage buff, a nuke, and access to very good off-field damage with no energy required. Even if you were to not stack any Fighting Spirit, she has full access to her skill. She can also fit teams that have an established main damage dealer, but decide to slot in Mavuika for a dual DPS setup. After all, her on-field time is not that long. However, let's talk about the most notable teams we can make for support Mavuika. Kinich can really use a character like her, especially to ditch the high energy cost Shunling usually brings. There is however one major problem that will annoy us, and that's how the scroll set on a Pyro unit interact with burning. If you apply Pyro first and then Dendro, it obviously doesn't work. The other way around, however, only works on the first instance of burning. But then, applying more pyro to an already established burning will not refresh the duration of scrolls. A team that only includes danger and pyro units will very likely not be able to sustain the set. A way to solve this is by adding a Hydro unit that could wipe out the burning aura every now and then, making Mavuika refresh burning, or trigger Burgeon, which counts as a pyro and danger buff. So the duo is strong, but will likely use Cinder City well only against multiple different enemy waves, or if everything dies in one rotation. And with the damage these two can do, that's low-key likely. For Kinich there are other options, but she definitely works well. Another main DPS that could use Mavuika is Moalani. However, Hydro characters like Florina, Yelan or C6 Candace are only sustainable by shunning, simply because Mavuika does not apply that much pyro. A team like Moalani, Mavuika, Shilonen and Sucrus can definitely work, although you have to be careful on the way your setup is done in AoE, as swirling Hydro will spread it and Mavuika has a hard time erasing the aura. One last example of a main damage dealer from Natlan is Chaska, but generally Bennett is of a higher value for her. Slotting both at C0 will make her lose a bullet conversion, but that can be worth it. Outside of Natlan there are other options, but then slotting in an extra Natlan character is kind of necessary. Shilonen will be very strong even in these teams. Examples are Navia, Risley, Line or Shiver's teams. Novilette is also another character that can utilize Mavuika and actually try to maximize her off-field damage, which is going to vaporize basically always. After this you can really get creative and just use her pretty much anywhere. I swear it's the last time I will say it, but be aware of how strong she can be as an on-fielder before you use her as a support. And that was all for my complete Mavuika guide. As always, I'm gonna follow up with a new episode of my 7 Advanced Tips series, especially covering her internal cooldowns in detail and particular combos she can do. I will try to push even more content here on YouTube for this new year. Thank you so much for watching, like or sub if you enjoyed, and see you in the next video.